All right, thank you for joining us. This conference is presented by CHIPS and will be recorded. Following the presentation, an evaluation is going to be sent out along with links to the slides and a recording, and they're also going to be available on the CHIPS website after today. I'm going to try to move quickly enough so that we have time for a short Q&A at the end. But if we don't have enough time to get to everybody's questions, feel free to email me or Enrique, and he's going to put our emails in the chat. But if you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to type them into the chat. I will try to get to them at the end. And if not, I will respond via email. If you could take a few moments, we're going to have a poll put up on the screen here just so that we can get a feel for who's in the room today. And then we'll get started once we have some responses to that. All right, those of you who just joined, we're just answering this quick poll, and then we will get started. I have a lot of stuff to cover, so we're going to get started here in just a second. All right, while everyone is answering the poll, I'll just introduce myself briefly. I'm Laura Sheehan, I'm Manager of Research Administration for UCLA Family Medicine. I have about 22 years in academic research, mostly here in UCLA. And my department has about $10 million in contract and grant funding annually, which puts us in the top 10 nationwide for federal funding. So hopefully that means you guys all can trust what I have to say and find me useful and helpful. I'm going to start a little stopwatch here just so that I can keep myself on track. Here are the objectives for today. Hopefully you guys have read through them already. We're basically giving a high-level overview of how to prepare a research proposal for funding. I'm going to go ahead and share the results so that we can see who's in the room today. Most of you are researchers or research staff, and most of you are at an academic institution. So that's great. That's sort of the target audience for this, but I will make this as accessible for everybody in the room as I can. All right. So if you haven't guessed by now, I am going to be moving through these slides incredibly quickly. I want to get to the important stuff and zoom over, no pun intended, all of this stuff that's just not as helpful as the rest. So bear with me. I'm going to try to speak quickly but clearly, and hopefully we can all get through this together. So let's dig right in. Roles and responsibilities. Who are the players in a pre-award world? We've got the PI, or the principal investigator. This is the person who's going to determine what funding opportunity to go for. They're going to review the guidelines. They're going to develop the proposal. They're going to have their hands on everything involved with this proposal. The buck stops there. The research team is everybody else. They're going to assist as needed with the development of the proposal. I do want to talk a little bit about key personnel and what that means. The federal definition is right there. It's individuals who contribute to the scientific development or execution of a project in a substantive way. That's a very vague definition, and I often get questions about who qualifies as key personnel. And the short answer is, if you're not sure, reach out to your department admin. But for the most part, if they're a co-investigator or a faculty member, they're going to be key personnel. And if they're staff, they likely won't. But there are exceptions where staff is considered key personnel and a faculty member might not. Subaward research team, that's separated out because they have additional responsibilities. We're going to get into what a subaward is in a moment here, but that team is responsible for making sure that they have gone through all of the internal approval process at their institution, and sent that over to us. The department admin, you might not have somebody at this at your institution, depending on where you are. But if you are at a large academic institution or a large other type of institution, you likely will. This is somebody at the department or the divisional level who is there to assist with the proposal process. Somebody like me or a fund manager or somebody like that. Typically, it's their responsibility to get signatures on internal forms. They're going to be submitting to a central office for approval. And often they're going to be an expert in helping out with things like the budget and items like that. The authorized official, or AO, is somebody in a central office. They're going to be reviewing the proposal for compliance with both institutional guidelines as well as the sponsor guidelines. And they are the only one who is authorized to sign off on a proposal. And often they are the one that actually submits it. And last but not least, we have the sponsor or the funder. They're the ones telling you they have money, reviewing your application to see if they're going to give it to you or not. Let's move on to, there we go. So I said we were going to talk about subawards. Let's very briefly talk about that. If you are applying for funding and a sponsor gives you the money and all of the money is going to stay with you, you are doing all of the work within your institution, there are no subawards and this slide is irrelevant. If, however, any portion of your study is going to go to another institution, if you have a co-investigator at a sister campus, or you're working with a small business, or you're sending chunks of money to a clinic, each of those sites would be considered sub-recipients or sub-awards, sub-sites, all the same thing. And from their point of view, you would be their sponsor because you are the one giving them their money. And then the prime sponsor is the original awarding agency. So the one in the middle is what we call the pass-through entity, or PTE. Sometimes you might be the subrecipient. Let's say you're doing a research project with UCSF and they got their money from the NIH. In this case, your institute would be the subrecipient, UCSF would be the sponsor or the PTE, and the NIH would be the prime. If you have any questions on that, feel free to type it in the chat. Let's talk briefly about the research process, exactly what goes into the order of things. So we start off with an idea, right? As a researcher, you're going to have some inkling of an idea of what you want to research, but you'll notice that the development of the proposal is separated here. It's not the same thing. And that's because you really want to find your funding opportunity before you get too deep into the weeds. You want to know exactly who you are applying to, what are they interested in funding before you really flesh out the meat of your proposal. So you have an idea, then you look for funding, you find an opportunity that's just right, you're a developer proposal, we'll talk about all of this. You route it for internal approval, that's typically within your department. That's where your department admin person comes into play. And then they are going to submit it for central approval from your authorized official. If everything is good to go, it gets submitted. The reviewers take a look at it and they didn't like what they saw. And they sent it back and said, no, it's not going to be funded. And here's why. That's okay. You have a gift now. You have a critique telling you exactly what is wrong with your research proposal and how to fix it. For the most part, this is a great thing. This is going to allow you to rewrite, and you don't have to go back to the idea phase. You don't have to look for another funding opportunity. You know exactly what to fix for this opportunity. So the next time you can resubmit and hopefully get it funded. If, however, their critiques are just not doable, it's not a good match, then yes, go back to the idea phase, find a different funder and move on from there. Let's assume the next time you do it, you get awarded the project. They're going to send a contract to your institution. It gets signed off again by an authorized official. The award is processed. You actually do the work, and then it gets closed out. For the purposes of this talk, we're going to be focusing on this section here, the proposal part. All right, so I have dedicated an entire single slide to the idea phase. And again, that's because you don't want to get too deep into the weeds until you figured out who you're applying to. But I do want you to think about 3 things when you are working on your idea. And it's basically, you've got to answer these 3 questions. Convince the reviewer why they should care. This is your significance. How is this significant? This is where you want to get passionate and convince them that your work is essential or fascinating or whatnot. You want to prove to them that no, somebody else hasn't already done this. This is unique in some way, shape, or form, and I will tell you exactly how. That's the innovation. And then lastly, you have to tell them why on earth they should trust you of all people to carry out this research. If you don't have a great answer for that, you need to expand your team before you move forward. If there are gaps in your knowledge that the reviewers are going to harp on, find somebody to join you as a co-investigator, as a consultant, as an MPI, a multiple principal investigator, to join your team so that you can fill in that gap before you move forward. So you've figured out your idea. Now you need to find the money. So we're going to talk a little bit first about the different types of sponsors. These are the people who are going to actually be providing money and opportunities. So just checking to see how I'm doing in time. Okay, great. So we've got internal sponsors. That is, if somebody at your institution is giving money to somebody else at your institution. These are considered internal. It's not extramural funding, so it often does not need to go through an authorized official. An example would be actually CHIPS. Let's say you are at UCLA and CHIPS is going to give you some money to do work here at UCLA. That's internal. It doesn't have to go through the central office to get approved. Other types of sponsors, you've got your government, federal, state, and local, the biggest of which would be the NIH. You've got higher institutions. These are academics, et cetera, universities and whatnot. Private or nonprofits, you've got your PCORI, your Robert Wood Johnson, your Bill and Melinda Gates foundations. And then last but not least, you've got your for-profit. These are also called industry sponsors, Pfizer, Moderna, BMS, et cetera. Each of these types of sponsors are going to have their own rules and regulations for them and for your institution. So you're going to need to know exactly who are you applying to, as different rules will apply. I wanted to share some stats that are UCLA specific, but likely are very similar to other academic institutions. Probably not the dollar amount because we're pretty big, but the percentage distribution is likely similar at most academic institutions. And you can see the biggest chunk of contract and grant funding for UCLA came from the federal government. And then if you were to take a look at that slice in more detail, you would see the biggest chunk of that is the NIH. So we're going to be talking a lot about the NIH today. I'll give you examples and then I'll say, and the NIH does so and so. And this is why. They are just a huge player in the kinds of research that most of us are doing. So let's jump right in. Let's talk about the NIH. Technically, the NIH is composed of 27 different ICs or institutes and centers. Here they are. Each one of them has their own mission, their own pot of money, and you're going to want to familiarize yourself with all of them because you need to know which one to apply for. There are 2 fabulous resources. And again, these slides are going to be made available to you. These are actual links that will take you there. NIH Reporter and the Matchmaker interface. They basically are ways to connect you with research projects that the NIH is currently or recently has funded and which IC did the funding. So you could literally copy and paste your draft abstract into the Matchmaker tool, and it'll bring up 100 most similar projects that the NIH is funding, and you can look at who the program officer is for it, which IC was it. Because some of your research might fall under multiple ICs, like you have NIDA, that's, drug abuse, and you have NIMH, that's mental health. So if you're doing research on, drug abuse in populations with mental health disorders, which one do you apply for? These tools are going to help you figure out which groups are funding specifically the kind of research that you are interested in doing. Down at the bottom here, I've summarized some of the main players at the NIH. The one you should pay most attention to is this first one. That's the program officer, or the PO. This is the guy or gal in charge of all programmatic and scientific aspects of the IC. This is the person that you're going to want to talk to before you submit a proposal. And likely, you're going to want to talk to more than one PO at different institutes. You're going to send them an email. That email is going to say, "Hi, this is my name. This is the research that I'm doing. Attached is my bio sketch and the abstract of something I'm thinking about, or the specific games or something that I'm thinking about applying for at your institution. Do you think this would be a good match?" You don't have to say, "Oh, I'm sorry to bother you." No. This is their job. That's what they're there for. So reach out to them, reach out to more than one, and find out which one is the best match. And then you can move forward from there. The other twos, the SROs and the GMOs, I'm not going to get into right now. They're more involved in the technical administrative aspects of this. All right. So how to find funding opportunities. This is, you're going to be looking at sponsor websites. Grants.gov is the place to go to if you're looking for federal opportunities. So NIH, CDC, DHHS, all of that, NSF, it all falls under grants.gov. You can use the tools that I mentioned earlier to figure out which IC, but the funding opportunities are going to be here. I also highly recommend SPIN. This is a resource that will require a subscription, but if you are at a large academic institution, it is very likely that your institution already subscribes. So you can use your institution's credentials to log in. Your institution might also have a research office, and their website at UCLA, it's the REO, and they will have links to all sorts of different funding opportunities to explore. Also reach out to colleagues, both at your institution and other institutions, especially people who do the same kind of work as you, to see where did they get their funding from. Subscribe to newsletters, that's both within your institution as well as from the sponsor. And last but not least, Google is your friend. When in doubt, type in what you're interested in researching, plus the phrase funding opportunity, and you will find all sorts of fabulous information there. Again, if you guys have questions throughout all this, type them into the chat. We are going to try to get to them at the end. All right, let's say you found your funding opportunity and you're like, this is the one, this is what I want to apply for. The next step is to take a look at the sponsor guidelines. Now, this next slide, if you only remember one slide from this entire hour, I want it to be this slide. And you're going to laugh when you see it. But this slide is read the directions. And I'm serious. Read the directions. You would be amazed how many people don't, and how much trouble would be saved if they just read the guidelines. So please, please, please read through them. This might seem like a Herculean task if they're 100 pages, but trust me, you will want to have read through it. Even the one-pagers, I have people who don't read through it. So you're reading through, you're listening to Laura, and you're reading through your guidelines. What do you need to pay attention to? This is one of my ugliest slides because I squeezed in a lot of information. I was trying to point out what the important bits are, but the truth is they're all important bits. But let's focus on a couple of really important parts. I recommend getting a highlighter when you go through your sponsor guidelines and highlighting these bits to remember. So first and foremost, eligibility. make sure you're actually eligible to apply. I have experienced a PI who spent a couple of weeks working on a proposal, and then when they sent me the guidelines, I read it and saw they were not even eligible to apply. Don't let that happen to you. Oh, it looks like we've got somebody whose speaker is on, but I'll let somebody else handle that. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm doing all right? Okay. So another thing you want to pay attention to with eligibility is limited submission. So there is a restriction on some opportunities where they will say you are only allowed to apply or we are only accepting one application per institute or 2 applications per institute or some limit. If you see that, you need to reach out to your leadership to make sure you are okay being the one that submits. At UCLA, we have a limited submission office, and there's a portal that you would go to and do a pre-application. Here's who I am, here's what I'm hoping to do. Do I have permission to submit on behalf of UCLA, yes or no? And they will let you know. If you are at a large academic institute, you would likely have something like this. If you are at a smaller institute, reach out to leadership, reach out to any colleague who might be interested to make sure you are the only one who's going to apply. Because if more than one of you apply, both of you will be ineligible and they won't even score it. It'll be thrown out and you will be disqualified, and you don't want that to happen. So step 1, make sure you're eligible. Look at the purpose. This is especially important if it is a private foundation. They usually have a very specific thing that they want to fund, and you want to make sure that your research really speaks to it. And if it doesn't, change it. Change your research to match exactly what they're looking for, even if it means narrowing the scope. Or if you're not comfortable with that, find a different opportunity. Don't waste your time if you're not going to answer exactly what they're looking for. The due dates, of course, important. The required elements or section. This is really important. A lot of people think they know exactly what they're going to be asked, and then they look at the guidelines and it's different. Or there might be a specific template that they want you to use. Find that out right at the beginning. Page limits and formatting requirements. Nobody ever wants to pay attention to this, but you have to. I know somebody personally who was 1 page over on a single bio sketch out of like 12 bio sketches, and the entire proposal was rejected, returned without even being discussed, no score. Don't let that happen to you. If you're not good at this, have somebody join your team who is a stickler for detail and put them in charge. Budget restrictions, take a look at the total amount that's allowable. Are you going to be able to feasibly achieve your scope within that dollar amount? If not, find another opportunity or narrow your scope. Check for unallowable items to make sure that there's nothing in there that is going to make your project not doable. Take a look at the submission method. How do they want you to submit it so that you know? Any other restrictions, such as, oops, were you supposed to submit a letter of intent that was due 2 months ago? And if you didn't, you're not eligible? Double check that. And then last but not least, you want to look at the review process. How are you going to be scored so that you know what you're going to be graded on when you actually start writing it? All right. Normally I would stop for questions, but I don't have time, so we're going to move on. So let's talk about the basic common elements of a proposal. Each one is going to be different, but for the most part, these are some of the things that are going to be discussed. An abstract. This is really important, and it's often written last because you need to know exactly what you're going to do, and then you have to tighten it into a little nugget that's usually 30 lines or less. Be aware that abstracts, especially to the federal government, are going to be publicly available, so don't put any proprietary information and try to keep the language somewhat lay. Project narrative. This is specific to the NIH, but I get a lot of questions about it. It is 2 or 3 sentences max. It is short. And all it does is talk about how your research is relevant to public health. This is basically used by your congressperson. This is so your congressperson can go back and say, I helped bring in funding that studied 2 or 3 sentences, fill in the blank. So that's who you're writing it for. The specific aims, another really important part. I recommend starting with a brief background and rationale, and then your hypothesis in bold. Then you can go into your specific aims if you have room to have that. Obviously, your specific aims are the important part. How many? I get this question all the time. Usually 2 to 4, but it really depends. If it's a small pilot, 1 is fine, maybe 2. That's okay. If you have more than 4, you're going to need to pare back and see, are you able to actually achieve that within the scope and the constraints of your project? It's usually a page or less. Some interesting tips I wanted to share. Your aims should not be dependent upon each other. So if you, depending on the outcome of aim 2, you're not going to be able to do aims 3 or 4, you've written your aims wrong. They cannot be dependent upon each other. Also, use specific language. Don't say to study, we know you're studying it. This is a research study. We want to know exactly what are you trying to determine. So be specific. All right, your research strategy. This is the meat and potatoes of the proposal. The length really depends. I've seen it as short as 1 and as long as 25. Again, read the guidelines and you will know what your length should be. Any research strategy, however they want it formatted, are always going to ask you 3 things, and that's the significance, the innovation, and the approach. Significance is where you're going to get passionate. You're really going to tug on those heartstrings to get them to care about what you're going to be studying. The innovation is where you're going to say, what gap are you trying to fill? And the approach is where you got your design, your data analysis, and methods. You're going to need to prove feasibility. So keep in mind the scope and size. It has to be big enough to be statistically valid, but it also has to be reasonable within the constraints of your project. Strengths and weaknesses, don't skip this, especially the weaknesses. If you don't point out what your research project is not going to do, your reviewer will, and they will assume you didn't realize it. So let them know, yeah, you're aware that you're only studying this and there's all this rest of it to look at. That's okay. You want them to know you are aware of the gaps. And last, your bibliography. Keep in mind, if it's for the NIH, you are not allowed to include links or URLs. So if you're copying and pasting from PubMed, you're going to need to go in and remove all of those links. I don't have time to get into it as to why, but just trust me, no links. All right, the environment. Don't reinvent the wheel on this one. This likely is going to be the same for every proposal that you submit, unless there's something particular about your study that you're using an unusual resource that you normally wouldn't. Often your department administrator will already have a facilities and resources page available to you that they can share, and you can tweak it as needed. The bio sketches, this one I could have an entire hour just dedicated to how to create a bio sketch. I will say, put somebody in charge who's detail oriented. Give yourself more time than you think. Your key personnel are all going to have to submit one. If this is your opportunity to convince the reader or the reviewer that your team is exactly the right team to do what you need them to do. All right. Let's see. Human subjects. This is only relevant if you are actually doing human subjects research. But assuming that you are, you're going to need to address these 4 items, which is the risk to the subjects, how are you going to protect your subjects against those risks, the potential benefits, and then the importance of the knowledge to be gained. Again, this could be its own hour-long talk. I will say, give yourself more time than you think to deal with these. And they keep changing. They added like inclusion of women and children, and then they are adding inclusion of people on all age spectrums, you know, because seniors were being left out. And so take a look at those and give yourself more time than you think to complete it. Other sections that I'm not going to get into, but you should be aware of, if it is a career development award, you might have a mentorship plan that you need to write. If there's going to be more than one PI, there's going to need to be a leadership plan so that you explain which PI is in charge of what. on that note, don't have more than 2 PIs. It is very rare that you would ever have more than 2, and you should probably be very well established before you suggest having more than 2 PIs. And letters of support, whatnot. All right, so those are all the common elements of a proposal except for one. And I want you to write in the chat if you can guess which element, very, very important, in fact, might be the most important besides the research strategy that I haven't talked about yet. If you have a guess, type it into the chat and let's see who's right. What's the element that I haven't talked about yet? Yes, 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 you guys are on it. That is right. We're talking about the money. We have not gotten to the budget, and that's because I saved the best for last. I have 2 hours that I could talk about how to create a budget, but I have about 15 minutes. So I am going to try to go through it as quickly as I can and really focus on the most important bits. So in general, your budget is going to need to address all of these things throughout. You need to make sure that everything that you are listing on your budget is allowable. How do you know if it's allowable? You read the guidelines, so you know exactly what is and is not allowable to be included. You want to make sure everything is allocable. That means relevant to this particular study and able to be categorized. You want to make sure it's reasonable. Sure, yes, you need to have, say, participant incentives, but offering them $1,000 to come to a study visit, that's not reasonable. Make sure it's reasonable. Necessary, make sure everything that you're including in this is actually imperative for the research and consistently applied. That means if you tell the NIH that your rent is $2,000 a month at your office, but then you turn around and tell PCORI that it's $5,000 a month, that is a huge audit flag. You will get in trouble. Make sure you are consistent with between funding opportunities. We're going to go through the common elements of a budget here. There are going to be sections that I've skipped, but these are the most common and most relevant and the ones that I get the questions about the most. Personnel. So they're going to want to know how much effort are your people dedicating. So first they want to know who, right? Your PIs, your co-Is, your study coordinators, research assistants, statisticians. This is going to be any employee that is working on your project specifically. And you notice I said employee, that means don't include your consultants here. If you have personnel at another institution, they are not an employee of your institution. They don't go here, they go somewhere else. You're going to want to tell the reviewers how much effort are they dedicating to the project. They usually want to know either in percentage or person months. Person months is pretty easy if you are a regular employee, you just times the percentage by 12. If you are an academic employee that only works 9 months out of the year and you get your summers off, that's where it gets a little bit tricky. But otherwise, they just times it by 12. Most institutes will cover benefits for employees, so you need to make sure you're budgeting for that unless your institute does not provide benefits, which is rare. If you were here at UCLA, I have a link to our composite benefit rates, so you know which benefit rate to use for which personnel. I always get asked, as a PI, how much effort should I dedicate to the project? And the answer is, I don't know. This is your project. You should really have a better handle on it. Think about how many hours a day are you actually going to be working on the project, or how many days a month. However it helps you wrap around it, that'll help you get to the figure. But if you're looking for a rule of thumb, here are some examples. For the R series, I didn't get into the different types of series at the NIH, but if you're getting an R from the NIH, typically 15% or 1.8 calendar months. If you have multiple PI, more than one PI, it'll probably be less, maybe 10%. On average, I would say PI effort varies between 8% and 40%, with some exceptions. If you are beyond either end of that, you're going to want to explain it in your proposal. Why do you really need to be dedicating 50% of your time to this project? If you have almost no research team, maybe it makes sense because you're doing multiple roles. if it is a career development award, like a K from the NIH, they have a minimum of 75% effort. So they really want this to be all you're doing for the most part. So just make sure that it's justified. Equipment, you are rarely going to use this unless you are doing laboratory research. This hardly ever comes into play, and that's because equipment needs to cost more than $5,000 per unit. So we're not talking about your computer unless it's a supercomputer. We're talking about like a huge PCR machine that you need to run or something like that. Travel, you're going to want to separate study travel from conference travel. Study travel being I need to cover my mileage to go to the different clinics in the area to enroll patients. Whereas conference travel is I'm going to that national conference in DC to present my data. The link down here is great if you're trying to figure out, they're going to want you to itemize. So you can't just say, yeah, $5,000 for travel. You have to say X dollars for flights, X dollars per night for 3 nights of hotel and 4 days of food. So if you're looking for what rates to use, this is the place you want to go. It has every city in the world, and it'll tell you how much you should budget for hotel and for meals and incidentals. All right, subawards. We talked a little bit about subawards earlier, but be aware that they need to basically have their own mini proposal that goes through their own internal approval process and gets approved by their authorized official before it comes to you. So you're going to need your budget, justification, and scope of work at the least from each subsite. Be aware that the scope of work is going to be your legal document if you get awarded. If you have a site that you're worried about performing well, make sure your scope of work is very thorough, because if they don't do what they say they're going to do in the scope of work, you don't have to pay them. But if you didn't say it in your scope of work, you have to pay them. So make sure that that's written well. It doesn't have to be too long, depending on the scope. Often, if you are the PI, you're going to be creating a draft budget for your subawards, or at least giving them a maximum dollar amount so they know what to work within. And then they're going to send it to you and you're going to say, oh, that's too much. We don't have room for that. Or, oh, all the other subsites are doing 10% effort. Maybe you should do 10% effort as well. Other sections, materials and supplies. This is where your computer is going to go. I often recommend adding a section called project specific supplies. This is going to be your catch-all. It doesn't have to be a lot of money, but if you don't have anything in your budget for project specific supplies and you end up needing to buy something small, often your institution won't let you use the grant funding because you didn't say anything about that in your budget. But if you have this section here, most things fall under that title. And you can keep the definition vague. Again, if it's less than $1,000, you don't need to get super duper specific. Publication costs, journal fees, if you're going to create a poster for a conference, publication costs. Consultants, so these are not employees, they're not considered key personnel. Make sure you read the guidelines to see if there's any rate limit on how much you can pay them. Rent, incentives, talk to your department admin or your AO to find out if there's any mandatory institutional costs. Here at UCLA, we have stuff like TIF and Gale that might need to be included, and you're going to want to make sure that you roll that in. Indirect costs. Okay, we get a lot of questions about this. And again, I could spend an hour talking about it, but we don't have an hour. So direct costs are expenses connected directly to a specific project, and indirect costs are involved with maintaining and running an institution. So for example, typically the building itself that you're working in, that's paid for from indirect costs. Your HR department, your accounts payable department, your IT, those are all things that are needed to run the institution, but you're going to be utilizing their service to run your project, but all of that is indirect costs. That's needed to maintain the institution. In theory, general office supplies should be covered by indirect costs, but talk to your institution to find out. Here at UCLA, for example, it only to an extent. So if you need to send out, I don't know, 5,000 questionnaires to various participants, we're going to make you buy the envelopes and the paper to print all that from your grant budget. We're not going to pay for that out of indirect costs if you don't get enough money. So that's specific enough. You need it to, that even though it's paper and envelopes and it seems like it should be indirect, it might be allowable to be budgeted as a direct cost. They're often called overhead or F&A, IDC. It's all the same thing. There is a set ratio for your institute, and I highly recommend you reach out to your department admin or your authorized official to get info because it's very complicated. But typically you will have a federally agreed upon rate or more than one rate, like UCLA has on campus versus off campus, etc. If you don't have a federally approved rate, if you are a small institute, you might not have one, in which case you are eligible for what they call the federal de minimis rate, which is 10%. Be aware that some funding opportunities might not allow you to budget for indirect costs, or they might put a cap on how much indirect costs you're allowed to ask for. If that is the case, be sure that you reach out to your authorized official or your department admin to make sure you're actually allowed to apply for it. You might have to get a waiver in order to accept an award like that. There might be a waiver on hand already, or you might have to submit additional paperwork to get it. All right. Other considerations that we don't have time to delve into deeply, but I wanted to point out multiple years. Let's say you're asking for a computer in year 1, you're probably not going to ask for another computer in year 2, 3, 4, and 5. So your budget should likely be different from year to year, depending on the project. Make sure you've looked at the restrictions, read the guidelines so that you know what is and is not allowable. And for the most part, round to the nearest dollar, unless it says otherwise. They don't want to be messing with pennies on budgets. And you're going to mess up your totals. If each line is not rounding to the nearest dollar, it's going to get confusing when you're trying to figure out exactly how much indirect costs to apply. So now we're talking about the justification. You've got the budget, you know how much you fiddled with that. Don't do the justification until you've got the numbers. Otherwise, you're going to end up rewriting your justification 1,000 times. This is your narrative explanation for each line item and telling them why it's necessary and how you came up with the number. Organize your narrative in the same way as your budget. So same topics and categories, etc., especially if they have a template that they wanted to use for the budget. If it's less than $1,000, you can keep the justification simple, 1 or 2 sentences, that should be fine. But if it's a unique, a really weird, or a really expensive item, you're going to want to justify the hell out of it. You're going to really need to explain why you came up with that number, and how you explored other alternatives. Maybe you got quotes from multiple places, and prove to them that this is reasonable, because they will be judging you on that. And of course, make sure your figures match. If you said $499 in the budget, but then your justification says $500, that's a no-go. They have to match exactly. Here's my LA Times rule. This is a fake LA Times cover for the record. But when writing your justification, I want you to imagine that it is going to be printed in the newspaper. Your taxpayer money is going to fund fill in the blank. And you do not want to be embarrassed by what has been published. You want somebody at the LA Times who's reading this to say, yeah, that's actually a very reasonable use of my taxpayer money. If there's any question and you think somebody would say, what? They're spending money on what? Don't include it. Don't ask for it. If you do think it's really legit, if they just had more information, give them more information. This is where you want to convince them that you know what you're talking about. You're not asking for too much. You're asking for just the right amount, and here's why. All right. So you've looked through all the elements of the guideline. You've figured out what you need to budget for, etc. Now, this is when you assemble your team, and you're going to assign different people to different tasks, making sure that you have enough time to establish everything. This is an example of what I do, what I call my game plan. I have the elements that the sponsor wants, or the things that we need to do over here on the left, the responsible party, that's who's going to be in charge of it. And then I have a due date. When do they need to get it done? When I make these plans, I always start at the bottom. And when is it due to the sponsor? And then I move backwards from there. At my institute, the authorized official needs to receive everything 5 business days before it's due. So I've got the due date here, and then 5 business days before that, I've got submitted to the authorized official. So everything, I want everything to be due before that. And you can move from there. Some areas to consider. These areas are going to take longer than you think, so budget extra time for them. Bio sketches, especially if you have a large amount of key personnel, give people time to not only create it, but to send it to you. You look through them, make sure they're correct, send them back for corrections, get them back again, build that time into your timeline. Subawards, again, those subawards have to be approved by their authorized official, which means they probably need 5 business days on their end, and that has to be 5 business days before yours. So you really need to build time in, and if you have multiple subawards, even more time. And last, the human subjects is going to take a little bit longer than you think, in my experience, especially for junior or new investigators. Some things to consider. If you have a large team that you want to have a say in it, or if you are sending it to a mentor, build time for them to actually look at it and send you back their feedback. Don't assume they're going to get to it the same day. They won't. Don't forget to allow for holidays, especially if you're looking at 5 business days. It'll be 6 days if there is a holiday. And assume people are going to be late. If you need something on the 28th, ask for it on the 25th. And then you won't be panicking. All right, I know this has been a ton of information and you are all drinking from a fire hose. I do have a few more slides that I'm going to try to go through fairly quickly so that we have times for Q&As. But again, write any questions down that you have in the chat and we will try to get to them. All right, internal forms. This is one of my most UCLA specific slides, and that's because each institute is going to be a little bit different. But for the most part, some version of this will be applicable depending on your institute. I have a department-specific proposal intake form. Your department might have one as well. Basically, this is how you tell your department admin, hey, I'm going to be submitting something. Here's a link to the guidelines. Here's when it's due. It happens very early on in the process to get your department all on the same page. Your central office or your authorized official will likely have a form that they require you to submit when you send it to them for review. Here at UCLA, it's called an e-pass. Basically, it's going to gather all the information that they need to process it. It often requires signature by the PI and the chair, so build time in to allow for that. Conflict of interest forms. This is going, if your institute knows what it's doing, this is going to be required no matter where you're at. Sponsors assume that you have disclosed any conflict of interest, and the state of California will mandate that you fill out certain forms to state any conflicts of interest. Which form you have to fill in depends on what kind of sponsor. I don't have time to get into it at this one, but talk to your department administrator and they will tell you if you need to, what you need to complete. I will say this, if you're a sub-recipient, you have to fill in conflict of interest forms for your sponsor and the prime sponsor. So there could be 2 sets. And then one exemption I want to point out, if the sponsor or the prime sponsor is a nonprofit, tax-exempt educational institute, you don't have to submit a conflict of interest. They are exempt. So let's say you're getting money from Harvard and they got their money from NIH. Harvard is a tax-exempt educational institute, don't need to do a conflict of interest, but you do have to fill one out for the NIH. The submission. So let's talk a little bit about how you actually submit it. Second most important slide. You are never authorized to submit a proposal without approval from your authorized official. In some rare cases, if you are at a very small institute, the PI might actually be the authorized official. If you're at a very small institute and you're up in the leadership, it's possible, But other than that very rare scenario, you will never be authorized to do it, and you shouldn't. It will cause problems down the road. The sponsor is not sending money to the PI. They're sending it to your institute, and they are going to enter into a contract with your institute. So if you are not authorized to sign on behalf of, say, the regents of the University of California, you should not be submitting without approval. So here at UCLA, we require 5 business days. And if you're at an academic institution, your institute probably requires that as well. Here at UCLA, if it's a nonprofit or a government sponsor, it all goes to OCGA. Who the authorized official is varies, but it will be somebody at OCGA. If it is a industry sponsor, a for-profit sponsor, and it's a contract or grant, it goes to TDG. And if it's an industry and it's a clinical trial, it goes to CTCSR. Whoever it is at your institute is going to look at it. They might send it back for corrections, and then they are going to sign off. Often they will submit it directly. They'll include a cover page saying, if this is awarded, contact me and the PI, because they're the ones that are going to be signing the contract, right? It's not going to be the PI. It's going to be your authorized official. At UCLA, we often don't even have a submit button. It only the authorized official does. Occasionally, they will send it back and say, okay, we give you permission to submit. Here's my signature. And then the PI will submit directly. That happens sometimes. How does it actually get submitted? Read the guidelines and you will know. Sometimes it's just a PDF and they just want it to be emailed. But they might want that email to come from an authorized official. Other times it will be submitted via submission software. The most common one for federal government will be grants.gov. But I will point out, if you are at any UC campus or even any academic institute, you likely are not actually submitting via grants.gov. Your institute will likely have a system-to-system software. Here at UC, it is called Cayuse. And I know that's the most popular one in the United States, that basically will connect you to grants.gov. And these software, they're great because it'll walk you through step-by-step what you need, instead of grants.gov where it's like, good luck, fill in the blank. If it's a multi-component award, it's Assist. There's Smart Simple is a really common one. I know UCOP uses it. Sometimes the sponsor will have their own submission portal. The My RWJF is an example of that. Or there might be some other way that they want you to submit. All right, so you've submitted. Now you can just go lay down and take a nap, right? No, you're going to want to know, did it get awarded? And I always get asked, how long does it take to hear back? And the answer is, read the guidelines. Usually they will say in the guidelines when to expect to hear back. If they don't, check out the website. I will say that nonprofits tend to get back pretty quickly. Usually their deadline will only be a month or 2 before they make their decision. That is not the case for the NIH and other federal entities. Often it'll take 6 months to even be reviewed and up to 10 months to hear a final answer. Let's say you do hear back and bells and whistles, it got funded. Woohoo! Now you just wait for the money to come, right? No, you got work to do. Usually there's going to be supplementary information that they're going to want you to submit. It might be training certifications, or they might want other support info from all the key personnel. If you have human subject research, this is when you start your IRB. They say you're supposed to do your IRB at the same time that you do your proposal. I know nobody who does that because that is a lot of work for something that might not get funded. But as soon as you get a whiff of a scent that this is going to be awarded, you're going to want to start your IRB because it's going to take a while. And often your funding will be restricted or held off until your IRB is in place. So you don't want to wait for the money to come. You want to start that IRB process as soon as you think it's going to get funded. If you had any TBD positions that you were going to hire somebody into, now is when you start that process. You don't want to actually hire anybody until you have the money in hand, but you can post the job, you can write the job description, reach out to HR, make sure all the paperwork is ready to go, so that when you do get the money, you can hire somebody and hit the ground running. Let's say it wasn't funded. They sent it back and they said, we're sorry, but we think these weaknesses just made it not fundable. Hey, that is a gift. You now can look at exactly what they wanted you to fix and resubmit again at the next opportunity. If that's not doable and there's just no way you can tweak your research, go back to the drawing board, find a different funding opportunity that is a better match for what you're trying to do. And be like Dory and just keep writing, just keep writing. You will find a funder if you don't give up. Tips and takeaways all together with me now. Read the guidelines. Again, most important thing you can do, and of course, obey the guidelines. Make it pleasant to review. Don't give your reviewers a headache by getting rid of every bit of white space. They're going to scan, they're going to start skipping if you do that. And you don't want them deciding what to read and what not to read. Shorten it yourself so that you know which sections are the most important and leave only those there. If it's collaborative, make sure you're communicating with your team, have that game plan, and ensure you have enough time. This means making sure you have enough time to create the proposal, but also it means make sure you have enough time to carry out the research that you are saying you are going to carry out. If you are overfunded and very busy in your PI and 6 other projects, maybe you shouldn't be submitting for more. You need to promise the sponsor you're going to be able to carry out the work as you said you were going to do. There are going to be some resources here when you get the slides. Feel free to take a look at those. And I am now going to stop speaking and open up the floor for any Q&As. We've got about 4 minutes. So feel free to unmute. I'm also going to take a look at the chat here to see if we have any questions. Thank you so much for bearing with me and listening to my speed talking. Okay, so we've got somebody here, idea development phase. How much legwork should I do myself before reaching out and starting to form a team? Alternatively, should I reach out to potential collaborators first and work together to move the project forward? Do I write the specific aims and then shop around, or use the team to develop specific aims? Great question. I am a big fan of not spending a lot of work until you figured out your funding opportunity and your team. So yeah, for me, I would spend some time so that you can, have your elevator pitch ready and a focus for your work, but then find your team next. And then together you guys can work. Otherwise, you're going to end up rewriting everything when you pull somebody onto a team anyway. Especially if you were more junior and you're going to be reaching out to somebody with a little bit more experience, get them on board first. Otherwise, you might be wasting your time doing stuff that you might not need to do to begin with. Okay, good. Thank you. Lots of great comments here. Just trying to see if there's any questions, if any of the other hosts see questions that I don't have yet, let me know. Okay, yeah, so there is an evaluation. If you could take a moment to fill that out, it'll also be emailed out. That would be really helpful for us. So thank you for that. And I do other talks where I delve deeply into how to create a budget. So if that is something that you're interested in, feel free to email me. I'll be doing that later this year where I go into a lot more detail about what you want to budget for depending on your project and how to write a budget justification. And I was asked by somebody else to do one on biosketches. So if that's something you're interested in learning about, let me know and I can send you information about that as well. All right, we have just about 1 minute left. So if there are any questions and we didn't get a chance to answer them, please send them via email. If I get a lot of questions, we might send out an FAQ. Otherwise, thank you all very much for joining us today, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.